We're going to be starting chapter 16 in this video. So we're going to be looking at treatment of psychological disorders. Now, in the last chapter, we had looked at a broad array of different psychological disorders and things that would, say, qualify you for diagnosis in any of those categories. And as always, we're saying and stressing that we have a limited amount of time to cover a very diverse set of topics. So same thing applies for this chapter as well. We're going to do an overview of some of the most common different treatment strategies, but we're also going to acknowledge that there are hundreds of different types of specific therapies, and there is no way that we can touch on all of those. So we're focusing on broad categories and some of the most common types of treatments, but acknowledging that there is way more to it than that. Our outline for the chapter is going to start off with seeking treatment and the process of getting treatment. We'll then start looking at the psychological side of treatment and the different strategies that fall into that category. Then we'll get into biological treatment strategies, focusing more on, say, directly targeted things like drugs and psychosurgeries, things that are going to be affecting our brain activity directly. And then we're going to wrap up at the end, trying to evaluate the effectiveness of different treatments. And this will also include consideration in terms of how do we actually know if a treatment is effective? And we'll talk about some of our limitations there in trying to find evidence that supports the effectiveness of those different treatment strategies. But starting off, looking at the treatment process, looking at who's seeking treatment and why, as well as focusing on a lot of the limitations that come with seeking treatment and receiving treatment. Just for a brief overview to get started, we know that psychological disorders are very common. We got that across in the entire last chapter, talking about different disorders and their prevalence within populations. But as a bit of a reminder, we know that 1 in 5 Canadians are likely to suffer a mental disorder at some point in their lifetime. And having a disorder and maybe getting treatment or even not getting treatment can have some long-term effects on the individual and sometimes those around them. So we can start looking at things like financial costs, again, to the individual, but also to others. So if somebody has a disorder that impairs their functionality at work, maybe it makes them hard or makes it harder for them to work. Maybe it makes their work less effective. It might increase the likelihood of accidents or even just decrease productivity. That can have an impact in a whole bunch of different ways. And when we look at treatment strategies and seeking treatment and all the different structures in place to offer treatment, that itself will also have costs associated. So there's lots of things to consider in terms of getting treatment, not getting treatment, and the effects, large scale and small. To start off with some very obvious information, when we're looking at treatment, the goal is to help individuals change their maladaptive thoughts, feelings, and or behaviors. Basically, get to the point where the diagnosis is maybe not affecting them as severely. Or in some cases, treatment might lead to that diagnosis no longer qualifying. So we'd mentioned in the last chapter things like some individuals with major depressive disorder might have a single depressive episode and then never again. That might be something tied to treatment, but again, it depends very much on the situation. But when we're looking at this process, the very basics of it is typically we're going to see a client, the person with the diagnosis or seeking a diagnosis. So our short form talking about them as the client. Then we have the therapist. This is the person who is sort of proposing the different treatment strategies. We'll talk about different types of therapists in a whole bunch of different categories. But again, our short form, we're going to talk therapist and client and the fact that the two are going to work together through some kind of therapeutic relationship. So they're going to have different techniques that they might approach an issue with. So different diagnoses will have different treatment strategies that are more or less effective. But we're also going to find that different therapists will specialize in different areas of treatment and might choose what types of treatment they use based on the client they're treating, the diagnosis we're looking at, and whatever else they might keep in mind. The client themselves might also have a preference in treatment strategies. So they might seek out therapists that are going to align with their own sort of desires for treatment and what they want to get out of it. But there can also be a back and forth where they work together to find a therapeutic strategy that's going to work for them. And then we've presented it as the two work together, have a relationship that will allow them to apply these techniques, and hopefully we have a successful therapeutic outcome. We have some kind of effective treatment. And the type of treatment is what this whole chapter is going to be about, because this is going to be a lot of different options. But before we get into that, we can talk a little bit about who seeks treatment and when. So, when we're looking at the individual seeking treatment, our most common disorders that people are going to seek treatment for are related to anxiety and depression. Again, in the last chapter, we saw that these two categories of disorders are the most common, they're the most widespread, and therefore they are usually the most treated. But one of the things that we start seeing is the fact that a lot of individuals are going to have very long delays between the onset of symptoms and when they actually go and seek treatment. So, what this means is somebody with, say, an anxiety diagnosis in their future, they might be starting to feel those experiences of anxiety, maybe panic attacks, things like that. But until those symptoms are severe enough to actually start impacting their day-to-day lives, they might not actually seek treatment. So they might just deal with the symptoms until they get to the point where it's too much to handle in that day-to-day life. And again, back in the previous chapter, we had talked about sort of when does a disorder become a disorder? When is it a problem? Looking at those 4 Ds, talking about things like danger and dysfunction and discomfort and all the other things. This would be something that relates to that as well, because typically people won't make a change until it starts having a pretty big impact on their lives. We also have to consider things like maybe people have limited access to mental health resources. We know that it isn't something that's easily accessible to everyone all around the world. There are going to be limits there. We also have things like social stigmas. Maybe it's not acceptable to seek treatment, whether that's cultural, tied to maybe a religion, personal beliefs, any of that. Um, we do also see an interesting statistic, though, that about half of people who seek mental health services for some kind of diagnosis do not actually have a diagnosable problem. And on the surface, this seems like, well, maybe a lot of people are seeking help and they don't need it, and therefore maybe wasting resources and things like that. But we also want to consider the fact that sometimes people might seek treatment and might even receive treatment without actually receiving a diagnosis. It's a fairly common strategy in some places to not put an official label on something because it's easier to simply treat it rather than have, say, documentation that tracks the existence of that disorder. And that ties to a whole bunch of background things that we probably won't get time to go into. But things like there's a lot of concern about once you have an official diagnosis, what happens if that information gets into other people's hands? So, does an employer have the right to know that you have a particular disorder? And if they do or don't, what kinds of decisions can they make in regards to employment based on that? So, could they choose not to hire someone based on a diagnosis? So, that's its own whole process. But yeah, so this statistic, while on the surface it looks like it's telling us one thing, it might not actually be the whole picture, as kind of always. There's a lot of those considerations in the background. So like we've said, people, in order to seek treatment, have to overcome a couple of different things like recognizing that they actually have a disorder that might need treatment. So they have to actually know that this is something that they could seek treatment for. Again, usually the symptoms are going to get to the point where they start causing distress or interfering with their day-to-day life, and that's what's going to push them to seek treatment. So we said again, they tend to wait until the symptoms worsen because it has to have a large enough impact for them to actually go out of their way to seek treatment. But also, they need to know how to seek treatment. So, where are these resources? How can they access them? We also have to then look at things like cost. Is it something they can afford? Is it something that's already covered? Is it something covered through their employment? Or if they're students, are there services available on campus? which there absolutely are. So there's all sorts of things there that will interfere with seeking treatment. Or if there are programs that say raise awareness of treatment options that might actually encourage treatment to be sought sooner. So those types of education and awareness movements tend to be very effective. When we start looking at who actually receives treatment, this is another one of those cases where we're going to see that there's some variability in terms of receiving treatment and receiving effective treatment, which is a really important distinction. If you are seeking treatment, you would actually like it to help alleviate some of the symptoms associated with a disorder. And again, because one of the most common categories of disorders falls into depression, we can look at major depression disorder specifically. We find that for all the individuals that actually seek treatment for major depression, only about half of them are going to receive adequate care. And what we find is about a third of our individuals who receive treatment, it's not adequate treatment, meaning that it's not necessarily helping alleviate symptoms. They maybe don't feel any better. And this could be for things like, say, treatment-resistant depression refers to individuals who don't respond to traditional drugs that treat depression. So there might be different strategies that they could have tried, but in their seeking of treatment, the treatment that was used for them was not effective. And sometimes after a ineffective treatment, they might not be motivated to continue seeking treatment to try different options because of all of those previous reasons. It might be expensive, hard to access, so on and so forth. We also find that there's a huge limit to resources and definitely an issue with non-equal distribution of availability. So not even to consider the fact that different countries have drastically different availability and access to different mental health treatment facilities, we actually find that there are things like within cities, it's easier to get treatment than if you're in a rural area. Technology is making that a little bit easier because you can have, say, virtual meetings, but that's still something that requires you to have a stable internet connection and, again, access to those programs and knowledge that they exist. But even if we look not even across countries, but within Canada, different provinces have different systems and different sort of setups and what's covered and not covered and how you can access different services and rules and things like that. So there's all sorts of limitations there and inconsistencies that can also lead to confusion. So with all of that out of the way and hopefully making it very clear that a lot of those sort of background things are their own entire cans of worms to get into in terms of issues and sort of considerations, but trying to continue onward, reminding ourselves here, so looking at our client versus our therapist, a lot of that was about the client and who seeks treatment. Now we can look at the therapist and the fact that there are multiple types of mental health professionals, not all of which are our traditional idea of a therapist. So of course, we have our psychologists and psychiatrists, usually the distinction here being that a psychiatrist is a medical doctor who has specialized in psychotherapy and specifically biomedical treatments, basically meaning they're able to prescribe psychoactive drugs if that's required for treatment. Psychologists tend to be more focused on, say, what we'll talk about as talk therapies, but our more psychological treatments would fall under their category. We can also get into social workers. Social workers are a very useful mental health resource depending on the situation. And we'll find that a lot of these end up being very specialized. So marriage and family counselors might help with interpersonal relationships within families. You might actually have, say, if you're part of a religious group, you might have counseling available there, whether it's through a religious leader or others within that community. There's also abuse counselors and others who are specialized for specific instances. So there are many, many different types of mental health professionals. But like I've said, we're going to use sort of the generic term of therapist and not specify as we move through the rest of the chapter. So that's just making that clear. And then getting into our approaches to treatment, like I've said, we're going to break this down into psychological treatments and biological treatments, but we're also acknowledging the fact that we can have combined treatments that involve both psychological and biological components. And so for a little bit of an outline, I have this diagram that I've borrowed from one of my other classes that actually does a pretty good job giving us an overview here. where we'll see at the top here, these are a lot of those different psychological perspectives we've been talking about all semester, looking at humanistic and psychodynamic perspectives, cognitive and behavioral therapies, and then the biological component. So we're going to sort of remind ourselves these all are going to fall into our psychological strategies, and the biological strategies will be over here for our discussion. But I just like looking at these and seeing, hey, we have all of these different perspectives that are each going to have therapies associated. So a nice map of what will be talked about in the other videos for this chapter.